Chapter 9. What are the odds? It's time to slow down, take a few deep breaths, and weigh the implications of these ideas. It's one thing to toss out theories, but sometimes quite another to make those theories work in the real world. Harsh reality tells us that sometimes it's impossible. It might be fun to ask, what would the world be like if there were no hypothetical questions? But of course, we'll never know. Is that the way it is with Kellogg's dream for Adventist evangelism? And more importantly, is there any realistic chance that Kellogg's ideas were even approximately what God wanted us to do back then? If so, the next obvious consideration is, what about now? But that's a huge jump. Now can wait. If we're going to get to now in all this, there's a great deal of ground that must be covered first. We've already looked at the concern of Kellogg's contradiction of Ellen White's comment on the loud cry. The individual reader, of course, will have to decide whether or not that concern has been allayed enough to warrant giving further consideration to Kellogg's thoughts. If it hasn't been, there's not much practical value in the rest of this book. But if that issue can be surmounted, others are waiting in line. Let's look at some of them. For starters, if Kellogg's basic premise that medical missionary work, covering everything from simple humanitarian activities to life-saving surgeries, as appropriately called for, is an essential component of the loud cry, then we would have to admit that the great majority of our denominational efforts to reignite the loud cry have been fatally lacking. Stop and think about the gravity of that for a moment, because that's a pretty big deal. Is that a position you want to try selling to God's people? At the same time, let's not make it worse than necessary. If Kellogg's general technique was right, and the techniques used since have been deficient, it does not necessarily follow that all the people who used those deficient techniques were morally flawed. There can be a difference between mistaken and sinful. But still, it's a pretty bitter pill to swallow. The second point to consider is that there was a living prophet on hand for 22 years after this 1893 episode. If God's people had taken a wrong turn away from his chosen plan, one would expect to find frequent and pointed comments from the Lord's mouthpiece. What would those divine messages be saying? For starters, we might expect something akin to, "No, not that road, stay on this one." If that didn't get the desired response, we might then expect to hear, "Stop, turn around." Eventually, as our route diverged further and further from the original plan, the message might turn to, "It's not worth going back now, but if you take this next corner, it will get you on a road that runs parallel to the first one." In other words, if Kellogg's thesis is even approximately correct, there should be evidence of actual effort, probably through the influence of the prophet, to get the Lord's work back on track. A plan B, if you wish, somewhat similar at least to the plan A, which was never deployed. A third point is that if medical missionary work really is tied in to the loud cry, then it should be possible to show that it is also closely related to righteousness by faith and the other theological concepts that we know are related to the loud cry. The first 2 points are matters of history and will be addressed in chapters to come. The third issue will be covered in detail in chapter 22, but is important enough that a partial explanation will be helpful here, so let's do that much right now. Is medical missionary work integrally connected to the loud cry? Let's consider another connection that is directly attested to by divine authority. Some of our brethren have expressed fears that we shall dwell too much upon the subject of justification by faith, but I hope and pray that none will be needlessly alarmed, for there is no danger in presenting this doctrine as it is set forth in the Scriptures. The exceeding great and precious promises given us in the Holy Scriptures have been lost sight of to a great extent, just as the enemy of all righteousness designed that they should be. He has cast his own dark shadow between us and our God, that we may not see the true character of God. The Lord has proclaimed himself to be merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. Several have written to me inquiring if the message of justification by faith is the third angel's message, and I have answered, it is the third angel's message in verity. Review and Herald, April 1st, 1890. This is a famous quote, but one wonders how much thought has been given it, beyond the obvious use of legitimizing the Jones-Waggoner message of justification by faith. The problem is that we seldom think of justification in any of the terms or images that we find in the third angel's message. Consider the contrast. Justification by faith is a most precious message that brings peace to the soul through forgiveness. By and large, we like the concept of justification, sometimes to unwarranted excess. The third angel's message, on the other hand, is, shall we say, somewhat more confrontational. We might condense the message something like this. If you worship the beast or get his mark, it's wrath for you, and you're going to burn. And these two messages are the same thing? Really? In which universe? Well, this one, actually. It's like heads and tails are the same coin, and the stuff in the middle that holds them together? That's the conflict between the truth and the lie, and an understanding of authority. Let's start with an illustration. Suppose you are a private in the army, the absolute lowest guy on the totem pole. When the sergeant yells, "Soldier, take this shovel, dig a ditch, 5 feet deep, 4 feet wide, 20 feet long, now." What are you going to be doing? Digging, obviously. Why? Because that sergeant could make your life miserable if you get him mad at you. Makes sense, doesn't it? But while you're digging, a lieutenant comes up, hands you a paper and says, "Soldier, take this message to Major Johnson, Headquarters Company C, on the double." Now what are you doing? Running, of course, with a paper in your hand. Why? Because a lieutenant could do even more damage than a sergeant. And then, when a Humvee skids to a stop beside you and a guy with 4 stars on his shirt yells, "Soldier, get in here!" it's a safe bet you'll be going for a ride. So far, so good. But what about the ditch and the message for Company C? Your life is ruined. The sergeant and the lieutenant are going to be furious that you didn't obey their orders. Well, no, not really. Oh, sure, they may be mad at you, but the general is your protection. He has suddenly become your best friend. Why? Because when there was a conflict of authorities, you wisely chose to honor him. You showed your faith in him through the act of obedience, and it is universally understood that as the higher authority, his command releases you from the command of lesser authorities and from the punishment that would otherwise have come for disobedience. He is your protector. This is exactly the situation brought to light in the third angel's message. The united powers of the world have commanded everyone to worship the beast on Sunday. If you don't, they'll kill you. On the other hand, God forbids you to worship the beast, and if you do, he'll burn you. You're between a rock and a hard place, and the rock is red, hot liquid brimstone. So, your move. Now, whom do you trust? Everything you can see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, not to mention watch on YouTube, tells you that your only hope is to fall into line with the world. And the third angel's message says not a single word of encouragement or promise, just a matter-of-fact statement of the results of doing wrong. Everything hinges on the individual's faith in one authority or the other. Are God's commands really for my best good, even when obedience to him could get me killed? Of course, though this test may be more severe than past death threats in some way or the other, this is only the entry-level challenge. The full test of Christ himself as the avenging enemy is yet future. That will be the ultimate test of faith in his wisdom, power, and love. The connection that makes justification by faith the third angel's message in verity is simple. To do the righteous thing by faith in God is righteousness by faith. And what would we suppose the right thing might be, given that Jesus spent his whole ministry doing medical missionary work? As to the third angel's message, we'll see in more detail later on that the only effective way to give the message is to live the message. Living out the principles of self-sacrificing service both strengthens our own faith and exerts the strongest influence for others to accept and live according to the same principles.